Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our webinar. I hope it's a beautiful day wherever you're at. My name is Tom Kelly. I am an industrial hygienist with the Bureau of Workers' Compensation. I work in the Youngstown Service Office. I provide safety and health consultations to employers in the northeast quadrant of our state. Today we're going to be talking about hearing conservation for general industry. There is a few differences in the hearing conservation requirements between general industry and the construction trades. So we're not going to be talking about construction today. This is strictly going to be for general industry. Today, what we're going to cover very quickly in the 45 minutes to an hour that we have, we're going to cover the anatomy, parts of the inner ear, physiology, anatomy and physiology. We're going to talk about how we hear and how hearing loss occurs. We're going to talk about how noise is measured, how to perform measurements in the workplace, and we're going to talk about some of the definitions of terms that are used in noise measurements. We're going to talk about the requirements for audiometric testing, hearing tests, and we're going to talk about the hierarchy of controls, ways to minimize noise exposure in the workplace. We'll talk about some engineering controls, job rotation, which is an administrative control, and hearing protection devices. Finally, we'll touch a little bit on some of the different standards that are applicable to noise exposure in the workplace. Well, start off with, why should we worry about noise? What is the big deal with noisy work environments? Well, according to the Centers for Disease Control, noise-induced hearing loss is the #1 most prevalent occupational disease in the United States. The World Health Organization says that noise-induced hearing loss is the most prevalent occupational disease in the world. Another reason we're concerned with noise is noise-induced hearing loss doesn't occur right away. If we have a sudden exposure to a really high noise, we can have a temporary hearing loss. Your ears might sound muffled for a little bit, say after you've gone to a concert or a racing event. You're walking through the parking lot to get back to your car and everything sounds muffled and you're having to have people repeat themselves. You can't hear the person you're talking with, but you go home, you rest overnight, and in the morning, your hearing is back to normal. Hearing loss that's noise-induced in the workplace takes place over years. It's gradual and it's also painless. If it hurt every time we were losing our hearing, we would probably take better care of our hearing. But it's painless and it's gradual. It takes a while. Quality of life for people with noise-induced hearing loss is reduced. You can't hear the birds singing as you used to. You might not be able to hear your grandchildren laughing. You have to turn up the television louder to hear it, maybe annoying other people in your household. When you're speaking with someone face-to-face, certain letter combinations you no longer can hear, so you're having to ask people to repeat themselves. You're only able to hear about a third of what they're saying. And finally, protecting workers from hazardous noise exposure is the law. The OSHA standard, Occupational Safety and Health Administration standard, is 1910.95, governing noise exposures in the workplace. So there are reasons why we need to worry about noise. It is an occupational hazard and it is a recognized illness in the workplace, hearing loss. We'll go into some definitions now. We're going to talk about sound, noise, and decibels, which is the unit used to measure noise. Sound is defined as a disturbance that propagates as a wave of compressions and rarefactions through a transmission medium. That's a fancy way of describing it. For our purposes, when we're talking about noise in the workplace, we're talking about pressure waves, sound pressure waves being transmitted through the air and reaching our ears. Noise will actually transfer through any type of medium. Noise will transfer through the air. Noise will transfer through water, through metal, through wood, through plastic. The only place that noise, the pressure waves of noise, the pressure waves of sound will not travel is through a complete vacuum. So the old movie where it said, in space, no one can hear you scream. Well, that's true, because in space is a vacuum. Sound pressure waves can't travel through that vacuum. But that's what we're talking about when we're saying noise. We're talking about pressure waves. The easiest way to visualize this is to imagine a still body of water, a puddle, a pool, a pond. take a rock and toss it into the middle of that water and watch the ripples. Where the stone hits the water, there's going to be ripples coming out. Well, sound pressure waves are about the same as far as you do this. There are pressure waves coming out from the point of impact. We just can't see them like you can in the pond. Now, when we talk about noise, noise is defined as unwanted sound. But for our purposes in the workplace, noise is any sound that's present in the workplace, whether I want to hear it or I don't want to hear it. If it's in the workplace, it's considered to be noise and it needs to be measured. It could be information that I need to hear coming over the intercom. If it's too loud, it's noise. It could be affecting my hearing. Radios. Some people like to have a radio next to them when they're working. Well, if it's too loud, that's noise. Our ears can't tell the difference between something we enjoy hearing and something that we don't like to hear. So any noise in the workplace needs to be taken into account for hearing conservation purposes. The decibel is the unit of measurement that we talk about when we're describing noise exposures. It measures the intensity of sound by comparing it with a given level on a logarithmic scale. So when we look at decibels, we're not looking at a straight linear scale. It is a logarithmic function, which is getting into a little bit more math than we have time to go into in our presentation today. There are different types of decibel weightings in use. There's the A-weighted decibel, the B-weighted decibel, C-weighted decibel, D-weighted decibel, and even a Z-weighted decibel. When we're talking about hearing conservation and noise in the workplace, we are strictly looking at the A-weighted decibels. So everything that we're going to be talking from this point on, we're talking about the dBA scale, A-weighted decibels. The difference between the different scales is for the A-weighted scale, it more closely approximates human hearing because it doesn't record, it doesn't measure those frequencies that are too low for humans to hear. Anything below, say, 20 hertz, the devices that we use to measure just won't pick those frequencies up. Since we can't hear them, they're not damaging our hearing in any area that we can hear, so we don't pay attention to that. Now, here, this little schematic, this is what our ear looks like. We'll talk just a little bit about how we hear. Now, we said that sound is pressure waves. So we got pressure waves out here, and they're coming into our ear. They're coming in that way. This is our ear. Now, medically, this is referred to as the pinna. I call it the ear. The ear acts as a funnel for these sound pressure waves to come in and brings them in through the ear canal where they reach the eardrum. The sound pressure waves cause the eardrum to vibrate, and right behind the eardrum are three tiny little bones, the smallest bones in the human body. They are called the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. Together they're referred to as the ossicles. Now these pressure waves come in and funneled in through the ear canal. They cause the eardrum and the ossicles to vibrate. That's taking this sound pressure and turning it into a mechanical force. That mechanical force is then fed into this little part of our body that looks like a snail. This is called the cochlea. Inside the cochlea, it's lined with tiny little hair cells that are called cilia, stereocilia. They're attached to the inner walls of the cochlea, and they are surrounded by fluid. The cochlea is filled with fluid, and these little hairs are in there. And those little hairs, the easiest way to picture those are imagining seagrass. If you've ever seen video or pictures of grass growing at the bottom of the ocean, it just sits there and kind of waves back and forth in the water. That's what these little cilia do inside the cochlea. Now what these cilia do, pressure comes in the ear up through the ear canal. The pressure wave makes the eardrum and cochlea vibrate, turning that sound pressure into a mechanical force. That mechanical force then causes these little cilia to vibrate or move back and forth, and that turns that mechanical force into an electrical impulse. The electrical impulse is then fed through the auditory nerve right here up into our brain where those electrical impulses are deciphered and turned into what we recognize as words or music or car honking. So hearing, very basically, hearing is sound pressure waves in the air being funneled in through the ear canal, being turned into a mechanical force by vibration of the eardrum and the ossicles, which is then converted into an electrical impulse inside the cochlea, which is then fed through the auditory nerve to the brain where it's deciphered as conversation or whatever else. Now, how does hearing loss occur? Well, there are different types of hearing loss. There is conductive hearing loss, there is sensorineural hearing loss, and there is central hearing loss. Conductive hearing loss is where there's a break in the path somewhere between the pressure and the cochlea. So conductive hearing loss occurs in this area right here. Conductive hearing loss is anything that blocks the path of that pressure from reaching the cochlea. Conductive hearing loss could be an excess of wax buildup in the ear. Conductive hearing loss could be a ruptured eardrum. We've all heard of a ruptured eardrum. That's going to break the path. The little ossicles, those three little tiny bones, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. If we suffer some type of a head trauma, could be a car accident, could be getting hit in the head with a baseball. Those little bones can get knocked out of alignment. They have to be perfectly lined up, just like gears, in order for them to work. If they're knocked out of alignment, we break the path. Conductive hearing loss can be repaired surgically. Our doctor can fix conductive hearing loss. If we have too much wax in our ears, doctor can wash our ears out, clean out the ear canal. A ruptured eardrum can heal. If the ossicle bones are knocked out of alignment, they can be surgically repaired. They can be put back in alignment surgically. It's my understanding that if the bones have deteriorated for whatever reason, they can't be put back into alignment. They can be replaced with titanium inserts. So conductive hearing loss can be repaired. Central hearing loss is where there's some type of damage to the auditory nerve. Normally this is an infection, some type of an infection that's causing the auditory nerve not to be able to do its job. That can be treated possibly by antibiotics. So that can be fixed. Sensorineural hearing loss, this is noise-induced hearing loss. This occurs inside the cochlea. This is what these little stereocilia look like inside the cochlea. This is a picture of the cilia from the ear of a frog. These little cilia, the stereocilia, they are little bundles of hair-like fibers. They're very, very tiny. They're 10 to 20 microns in length. So this is a picture that's been magnified many, many times over. These little cilia, they're in that liquid fluid and they're flowing back and forth, converting that mechanical force from the eardrum and the ossicles into an electrical impulse. If they are overwhelmed by high noise levels day in and day out, they will become stunned, and instead of flowing, they will be knocked down and they'll lay flat. If you continue to bombard them with high noise levels, they will eventually die. They will just cease to function, cease to exist. And once they're gone, they're not replaced. They don't grow back. So once they're gone forever. These little bundles, there could be anywhere between 30 and 300 to a bundle, and our entire cochlea is just lined with these. As a bundle dies, whatever frequency that little bundle of stereocilia was responsible for transmitting to our brain, we lose the ability to hear sounds within that particular frequency or in whatever range that little bundle of cilia were governing. Again, once they're gone forever. This is what we talked about: conductive hearing loss, sensorineural hearing loss, which is noise-induced hearing loss, central hearing loss, which is damage to the auditory nerve. And you can also have a combination. They're not each individual. You can have conductive hearing loss. You can have a ruptured eardrum as well as damage to some of the cilia inside the cochlea. You can have an infection of your auditory nerve at the same time that you have a buildup of wax in your ears. So you can have 2 or 3 different ones of these going on at the same time. Some of them can be fixed by your doctor, some of them can't. The only medical treatment for noise-induced hearing loss, damage to the cochlea, is what you may have heard of recently is the cochlear ear implant. That is a way of bypassing the cochlea and going directly from the eardrum ossicles to the auditory nerve, when you have to wear a device that can do that. Now, when we're talking about noise in the workplace, obviously we're thinking about our hearing. That's what we're primarily concerned with when we're talking about a hearing conservation program. But there are other health effects beyond just hearing loss that we might want to be concerned with as well. Working in a loud environment, our body initiates the fight or flight syndrome. Being in a loud environment, our body is constantly on edge. It feels like we are being startled, just as if someone jumped out and yelled boo at you. You feel that sudden surge of adrenaline. This is what our body is like all day long if we are in a high noise environment. Our pupils get larger, our heart beats faster, our blood vessels constrict, they get smaller, which has the effect of increasing our blood pressure. Our muscles tense up, particularly in the stomach and the abdomen. Our body produces more stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. The thyroid produces more hormones. So there are other health effects other than just noise. And it has been suggested that taking 2 different groups of people from the same labor pool, putting some of them into a work environment where it's loud, and taking others and putting them into a work environment where it is relatively quiet, both with the same type of machinery, both doing the same relative job, the louder work environment will have a higher injury rate. There will be more accidents not related to hearing, just because of the higher noise environment. Now, when we're talking about noise in the workplace, the first thing we do when we come in is we want to do a risk assessment. Some of the things that we're going to ask is, well, how often are workers exposed to this high noise level? What's the frequency? Is it 5 minutes a day? Is it 15 minutes a week? Is it sometimes you might have a maintenance person who has to go into a compressor room and put oil into the compressor, and that might take 15 minutes a month, and the rest of the time it might be relatively quiet in the facility. Or is it 8 hours a day, every day that a person is exposed to high noise levels? Well, aside from frequency, what is the intensity? How loud is it? Are we talking about something as loud as a lawnmower, or are we talking about something as loud as a jackhammer? So how often are we exposed to the noise? How loud is the noise? And what is the duration of my exposure to the noise? Am I being exposed to noise for 15 minutes a day? Or is it 8 hours a day, all day, every day? So how long is the exposure? How loud is the exposure? And how often does the exposure occur? Also, when we're doing a risk assessment, we will look at chemical usage in the facility, because there are chemicals that we use in the workplace that by themselves have bad effects on our hearing. If we are exposing people to carbon monoxide, possibly from propane lift trucks or some other type of combustion going on in the facility, carbon monoxide, organic solvents that we might have in a paint department, there are other types of chemicals that by themselves, they can damage our hearing. Now, if we're being exposed to those chemicals at the same time as we have a high, loud noise environment, we're going to have a synergistic effect that's going to be bombarding our hearing. So most audiologists and safety and health professionals will tell you that if we have a loud working environment, plus we are working with these what are called ototoxic chemicals, chemicals that are toxic to the hearing mechanism, that we should be giving more hearing tests than just annually. And then finally, as part of the risk assessment, we look at individual variability. There's no way to predict this. Some people are simply more susceptible, more sensitive to high noise levels affecting their hearing, just like some people are more sensitive to chemical exposures, just like some people can get stung by a bee and have no effect whatsoever, and other people who get stung by a bee need to be in the hospital right away getting treatment. Well, how loud is loud? We're talking about noise measurements, and we're talking about noise exposure in the workplace. Well, how loud is loud? Remember I said that noise is measured using decibels, and that the decibel scale is logarithmic. So 1 plus 1 does not equal 2. 5 plus 5 does not equal 10. Every time you go from 60 to 70, you haven't just increased it by a little bit. You've actually doubled that sound pressure, or more so. So when you go from 60 to 70 to 80 to 90, 90 is many times higher than 60 as far as measurement of the noise. So here's a few examples. A jet engine standing about 200 feet behind it on a runway as it's powering up, getting ready to take off, 140 or so decibels. That's really loud. We start to feel pain in our ears at about 125 decibels. Compressed air, which a lot of us use in our facilities, compressed air is actually a lot louder than we might normally think. Compressed air, measuring right as it's coming out of a nozzle, can be 100, 105, 106 decibels. A lawnmower, depending on the size of the engine and the condition of the mower deck, could be 90, 95, 98 decibels. Just standing in a quiet room, speaking with someone face to face, approximately 3 foot apart from each other, 60, 65, 70 decibels. Well, what are the allowable levels? Okay, it's conversation is 65 decibels, a jet engine is 140 decibels. What am I allowed to be exposed to? There are some different organizations that make recommended exposure limits. There's one group called the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, ACGIH. They issue what they call a threshold limit value. They say that noise in the workplace should be kept below 85 decibels. These are at an 8-hour average. So just because something really loud happens and it might go up to 90, 95 decibels, but it only lasts 5 seconds and the rest of the day is relatively quiet, that's not going to put us over this standard. The standards are all based on an average of an 8-hour day. So you could have a couple of hours of really high noise level and then 3 or 4 hours at relative quiet. By the end of the day, if it averages out below the standard, then we're okay. So ACGIH recommends that noise levels stay below 85 decibels. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, which is a part of the Centers for Disease Control, they have what they call a recommended exposure limit. And just like ACGIH, they recommend that noise exposure in the workplace stay below 85 decibels as an 8-hour average. These are both recommended levels. The level that has authority behind it and can be enforced is from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. OSHA has what's called a permissible exposure limit of 90 decibels. They believe that noise exposure should be kept below 90 decibels, and if we are exposing people above 90 decibels as an average for an 8-hour day, that's when we have to make hearing protection mandatory, and we have to look at engineering controls to try and reduce noise levels in the workplace. In 1983, OSHA implemented what's called the Hearing Conservation Amendment. And when they did that, they implemented or adopted what they call an action level. Their action level is 85 decibels. So when we're talking about noise exposure in the workplace as far as OSHA compliance, we actually have 2 numbers that we need to look at. If we are exposing our people below an average of 85 decibels, then we have nothing to worry about. We're fine. As soon as we begin exposing our employees to an average level of 85 decibels, we are required to implement a formal hearing conservation program. And that's what we're going to talk about for the remainder of this presentation. So again, OSHA, the permissible exposure limit is 90, but at 85, we are required to take certain actions. It's the action level, and the action we're required to take is to implement a formal hearing conservation program. Now, the requirements for monitoring employees on a hearing conservation program, this only applies to exposed workers. So if a facility has 25 employees, 5 of them work on one side of the facility where it's pretty loud. We're exposing people above that 85 decibel action level, but the other 20 are on the other side of the facility and it's quiet over there, and the two sides never really mix. The employees don't go back and forth between the two departments. So we have 5 employees who are exposed to high noise levels and 20 employees who are not exposed to those high noise levels. Only the 5 employees who are exposed above that 85 decibel action level have to be monitored on the hearing conservation program. So an organization can have a hearing conservation program, but only have a certain amount of employees monitored under it. And OSHA, through a letter of interpretation, has stated that the threshold for including people onto a formal hearing conservation program is 1 day of overexposure. So if a person is exposed above that 85 decibel action level, the average for an 8-hour day, doesn't matter if it's 1 day a month or 1 day a year. At 1 day, they must be included into the formal hearing conservation program. And OSHA's rationale for this is that some companies will have field engineers or other people who go out to different sites, and maybe 1 or 2 of the sites they go to and they spend a day, they might be overexposed to noise at just those sites a couple of days a month. So OSHA has said just even 1 exposure above the action level, that person must then be included on the formal hearing conservation program until the employer can state with certainty that that person is never going to be exposed to that noise level again. Now, a hearing conservation program, I've mentioned this a couple of times, a hearing conservation program is a written document. It's a written program that the employer has to maintain, and they're going to use this program to protect workers' hearing. The 5 elements that must be included in a hearing conservation program are: it's going to describe how you're going to do your noise monitoring in the facility, how you're going to determine what the noise levels are. It's going to describe the audiometric hearing tests that employees will be given. It's going to talk about the types of hearing protection devices that are available in the workplace. It's going to talk about how you're going to train your employees, and it's going to describe your record keeping. Again, this has to be in writing. So we'll go through each one of those 5 to give a little bit more information on each one. Noise monitoring. OSHA states that all noise sources in a workplace above 80 decibels have to be identified. This monitoring, noise monitoring, has to be performed whenever there's an increase in production or whenever new equipment is brought in or when equipment is rearranged in the facility to where noise levels might be increased. And again, these noise exposures are based on an average level that employees experience in an 8-hour shift, the 8-hour time-weighted average. Now, different ways to monitor noise in the workplace. The easiest and most accurate is what's called personal noise dosimetry, where you just take a noise dosimeter. There's one there in the picture here, and there's one that I'm holding in my hand. This device we will just clip on to representative employees, turn it on, let them wear it for the full shift. At the end of the shift, we take it off, we pause it, and it will tell us what the person's average noise exposure was for that shift. And it will tell us the highest noise level that the person was exposed to. It will give us a lot of information. This is the preferred method for monitoring employee noise exposure in the workplace. Now, we don't have to hook up every employee. If you have 100 employees in your workplace, not everyone has to spend a day wearing a monitor. We can do what's called grouping. If we have 10 people in one department, they're all working fairly close to each other, their noise exposures are fairly similar. If we hook up 1, 2, or 3 people in that department and find out what their average noise exposure was for the shift, we can extrapolate and assume that everybody else in that department has a similar noise exposure. Another way that we can measure sound levels is to just walk around and take direct readings. of each piece of equipment. This is not going to be as accurate as doing noise dosimetry, because when we walk around taking direct readings, then we have to do some math, because we're going to have to say, all right, this punch press is 95 decibels. Well, how many minutes in a day is this actually operating? How many minutes in a day is the person actually exposed to this? So if we're going to use direct reading like this, we're going to have to do some math. And the OSHA standard 1910.95 actually lists out the formula for calculating a daily noise exposure from direct readings. But if we're going to use direct readings, we're going to have to walk around to each piece of equipment, take a measurement, and then do a time study to determine how long a person is exposed to this noise level created by the equipment. If you don't want to go out and buy a noise monitor, you can actually download an app onto your smartphone. There are several available. Some of them are free, some of them you might have to pay for. But basically you download the app onto your smartphone and it will turn your phone into a sound level meter. Are they as accurate as a piece of equipment that is designed specifically as a noise monitor? Probably depends on which app you download. But you can stand there and just take direct readings of a piece of equipment with your phone. Some of the apps, you can actually turn your phone into a dosimeter. You download the app, turn the app into dosimeter mode, and if you're willing to leave your phone sitting out in a work area for several hours, you can just leave it there and come back at the end of the shift, and it will tell you what the average noise exposure was throughout the day in that department. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about audiometric testing now. Audiometric testing, it's a hearing test. You sit in the booth and you get your hearing tested. Now, if we are exposing people above that 85 decibel action level, when we have to implement the hearing conservation program, we have to give annual hearing tests to the workers who are included in that hearing conservation program. The first test that we give them is called a baseline. And then every year from that point on, we will give a person a hearing test, and we're comparing their hearing back to that original baseline. We're looking to see if a person's hearing is getting worse and worse the longer they're working for us. And then we have to document standard threshold shifts. If we do document that a person has lost hearing, a significant amount of hearing, then we will redo the baseline, and we will have to include that hearing loss on our OSHA 300 log. Now this is two different hearing tests transposed onto the same graph. A hearing test basically measures your ability to hear at different frequencies and how loud does the tone have to be for you to hear it at that particular frequency. Now again, there are two different hearing tests on here. This first one with the solid lines, it's left ear and right ear, so there's two lines. This is normal hearing. There's no hearing loss associated with this. Maybe just a slight dip here, but not enough to be overly concerned with. That's good normal hearing. Now this person, left ear, right ear, this person has noise-induced hearing loss. You can see that big dip right there. The 4,000 hertz, that's where noise-induced hearing loss tends to show up first. So an audiologist, the person who's giving this hearing exam, they will look at that and they will know right away this person has some degree of noise-induced hearing loss. They won't be able to tell that if it came from the workplace or if it came from extracurricular activities that the person might be doing on their own free time. They can't tell that, but they can tell that this is noise-induced hearing loss that this person is suffering from. Now, hearing protection devices. If we're monitoring people on a formal hearing conservation program, we have to make hearing protection available to them. If we're exposing people to noise levels at that action level of 85 decibels, we are required to make hearing protection available to them. We don't have to force them to wear it, but we have to make it available to them for their voluntary use. If we're exposing people to measured noise levels that exceed 90 decibels as an 8-hour average, we are required to not only provide the hearing protection, but to make it mandatory and to enforce it. So at 85 decibels as an 8-hour exposure, hearing protection has to be provided by the employer for the employee's voluntary use. The employer can make it mandatory if they choose to, but they don't have to. At a 90 decibel daily exposure, the employer is required to make that hearing protection mandatory. Different types of hearing protection devices. Number one, cotton balls, that's not acceptable. Cotton stuffed in your ear provides absolutely no noise reduction. The only time a person should have cotton stuffed in their ear is if their doctor has done something inside their ear and the doctor has put it in there. Otherwise, cotton balls in your ear for noise reduction, absolutely zero effect. The most common types of hearing protective devices are canal caps, ear muffs, or ear plugs. Earplugs and ear muffs have similar noise reduction ratings. Canal caps are less effective, and canal caps are normally not worn by people who have to wear hearing protection all day long. Canal caps are normally worn by maybe an office person who occasionally has to go out into the facility, and they're easier to take in and put in and take out. We're also going to talk about noise reduction ratings. Again, the most common type of hearing protection that we see in the workplace is earplugs. They can be disposable earplugs or they can be those semi-rigid reusable earplugs. This picture here, these are disposable earplugs, the type you just roll up and insert in your ear and wait for them to expand, and then you have properly inserted earplugs. Disposable earplugs are just that. They are meant to be disposable. So a person should not be wearing the same earplugs on Friday that they were wearing on Monday. They should be thrown away at least at the end of the day. Earmuffs. Again, the noise reduction rating for earmuffs and earplugs are pretty similar. They're almost identical if each is worn properly, but both have their advantages and disadvantages. Earmuffs can be a little bit hotter in a hot environment. They might interfere with our ability to wear safety glasses. If we're wearing hard hats, we're going to have a type of earmuff that's designed to attach to a hard hat. Now, any type of hearing protection that you purchase, on the box or the package that the hearing protection came in is going to have a little square on there that says noise reduction rating, or NRR, and it will have a number after it. It'll say NRR 28. The number is usually going to be somewhere between 27 and 33. This is the noise reduction rating. This is the number that you would subtract from whatever the measured sound in the work area is. The noise reduction rating is listed in decibels. So if the noise reduction rating is 30, theoretically, if you wear this hearing protection device properly, theoretically, it should reduce your noise exposure by 30 decibels. So if it's 100 decibels in the work area, we wear a hearing protective device that has a noise reduction rating of 30. Theoretically, we should only be receiving a noise exposure of 70 decibels. But that noise reduction rating that's listed on the package was determined in a laboratory environment. In the real world, we're not going to get that good of a protection factor. So in the real world, safety and health professionals use the following formula. We take the noise reduction rating that's listed on the package, we subtract 7 from that, and then we divide the remaining number by 2. So an example, the manufacturer's listed noise reduction rating on a package of hearing protection is 33 decibels. So we would take that 33 and subtract 7, giving us 26, and then divide that by 2, giving us a 13. The 13 is the real world noise reduction rating that we would consider that is acceptable or adequate for wearing in the work area. So if it's 90 decibels in the work area, you wear this noise reduction rating 33 equipment properly, you're actually getting a 13 decibel noise reduction. So now you're down to 77. Also in our hearing conservation program, there are requirements that employees receive training. The standard says that employees must receive annual training. It has to be done every year, and we have to train people. Everybody who is included in the hearing conservation program has to be trained annually in the health effects of noise exposure. They have to be trained in the elements of our written hearing conservation program, and they have to be trained in the type of hearing protection that are available to them at the work site and the advantages and disadvantages of each one. Now, record keeping. The OSHA standard in their hearing conservation program states that if we are doing noise sampling, we're doing noise monitoring on our work site, determining how loud it is, we have to keep those records for at least 2 years. After 2 years, we can dispose of them. The best practice, though, is to keep all monitoring records until they've been superseded by newer monitoring. So if I did monitoring 5 years ago in my facility and nothing has changed since then, the production rates are the same, the equipment is all the same, I'm going to keep that same 5-year-old monitoring data. Now, if I put in new equipment, or if I just decide it's been 5 years, I'd like to have the noise sampling redone, come in and do the retesting, resampling of the area, I would then take that new data and I would discard that 5-year-old data and I would keep that new data. Now, also under record keeping is the audiometric test results, the hearing test records of people who are included in the hearing conservation program and have been getting hearing tests every year. OSHA says the minimum retention period is for the duration of that tested worker's employment. So if I have 25 workers who are receiving hearing tests every year, and after 5 or 6 years, 3 of them go elsewhere to find employment, at that time I can discard the hearing test results for those 3 people, but I have to keep the test results for everyone else. Some employers choose to maintain hearing test records the same way that they retain all other employee medical records, blood tests or things like that that are required by certain standards. And that would be for as long as the person works there plus 30 years. That is not a requirement of the OSHA standard as far as hearing test results. You don't have to keep them that long, but some employers just choose to do that. And then finally, we're going to touch on the hierarchy of controls. This is going from most preferred to least preferred. If we have high noise levels in the environment and we want to reduce them, we want to protect our employees' hearing, or if we're exposing people above 90 decibels, we need to look at engineering controls. Engineering controls are changes in the workplace where we make permanent changes to reduce or eliminate the noise source. This could be things like building an enclosure around a loud piece of equipment, or it could be isolating a loud piece of equipment, taking it away from where people are exposed to it. A good example for that I mentioned earlier were air compressors. You'll notice that most facilities, even those that have air-powered tools, they don't have the air compressor right out in the middle of the shop where 6 or 10 or 20 people are standing around it being exposed to the noise levels. Most companies that have air compressors, they're located in their own room far away from production. That's called isolation. If the equipment that's generating noise doesn't have to be near people, then we just isolate it, move it somewhere else, and the machine is still doing its job. It's still functioning as it needs to function, but it's not exposing our workforce to those high noise levels. That's considered an engineering control. Some companies have implemented a buy quiet protocols where they work through their purchasing department to only purchase equipment that does not exceed certain noise levels, or they purchase the equipment that produces the lowest noise level possible for that type of equipment that will still meet our requirements in the manufacturing facility. Administrative controls are the second level in the hierarchy. This is job rotation primarily. We don't see this a whole lot for noise. We see this a lot for chemical exposures. It is perfectly acceptable for a noise control, but it's sort of difficult, because if we're going to use job rotation, basically what we're saying is, since the standards are based on an 8-hour average exposure, if a person is working in a loud environment for 3 or 4 hours a day, and then we transfer that person to a quiet environment for the remainder of the day, by the end of the day, their noise exposure, the average, will be lower. Hopefully it'll be lower, below the 85 decibel action level. If we do this, then we don't have to worry about a hearing conservation program. But if we're going to rely on job rotation, we're going to have to document, just like excursion tablets, we're going to have to document when the person was working in the loud environment, for how long, and for how long they were working in the quiet environment. And if we're going to try and do this for 30, 40, 50, 60 employees in a facility, that's going to be a lot of paperwork. So most companies don't use job rotation as a control for noise exposure. Finally, in the hierarchy of controls, the least preferred method, but the one that is used the most, is personal protective equipment. The hearing protectors, earplugs, earmuffs, canal caps. This is what we see mostly in manufacturing facilities or other facilities where there are high noise exposures. It's the least preferred because the hazard is still here. It's still loud out here. If we use engineering controls, we've eliminated the hazard. If we're relying on hearing protection, we're relying on something to protect us from the hazard that is still here. So we're having to make sure that people are wearing the hearing protection conscientiously whenever it needs to be worn, and that it's worn properly. And that very quickly finishes our webinar for the day. We will open this up for any questions that you might have. I thank you again for taking the time to tune in, and I hope you will sign up and tune in for our next week's webinar. Thank you again very much. Now we'll open it up for any questions.